Morning, everybody. Hope you've had a great week. Looking forward to a great week. Lots of turkey, pumpkin pie, all that good stuff coming up. But until then, let's go back and talk about Abraham. This is a class on Genesis. We're looking at, the subtitle is Bible Biographies. And we are into Abraham's biographical material, I guess you could say, if you want to think of it like that. Talking about him as a man and how God dealt with him or through him to bring a nation into existence through whom he brought his son into this world. So it's kind of a big deal. Chapter 13 is where we are this morning, talking about Abraham and Lot separating. I wanted us to look at this because I think this tells us something of the real character of Abraham. What did we talk about last week that sort of reflected negatively on his character, perhaps? Anything? Okay, his lying about Sarah being his wife or his sister. Which was she? Both. All right, you got it. So we're in chapter 13. I need 3 readers. I need somebody for 1 through 7. Who would like to read Genesis 13, 1 through 7? I just need one person. All right, Janie will read it. Janie has opened the door and led the way. Now let's go for 8 to 13. Who will read 8 to 13? Be careful not to. Oh, Harold's got it. And Danae, you can take 14 to 18. All right.
Then Abram said to Lot, "Please let those with no strife between us, between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If to the left, then I will go to the right, or if to the right, then I will go to the left." And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the valley of the Jordan, and that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar. So Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. And Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley, and moved his tents as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly, and sinners against the Lord.
The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, "Now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land which you see, I will give it to you and your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered. Arise, walk about the land through the length and breadth, but I will give it to you." Then Abram moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord.
Very good. Thank you all for reading. When you picture in your mind Abram and Sarah moving towards the land God's guiding them to, how do you picture them? I used to have this idea of here's Abram leading a camel and Sarah's on the camel and they're trekking across. Why is that not accurate based on what we're reading here in chapter 13? They had a lot of stuff. They had flocks, they had herds. He was rich in what else? Silver and gold. So he had a lot of stuff. which means, and I'm reading a little bit into the text, but I don't think too much. If you're wealthy in silver and gold and a lot of stock, how are you going to protect all that stuff if there are no state police around? You're going to have somebody with you. Now, of course, this is in chapter 14, but do you remember how many men chapter 14 records Abraham as having on hand who were trained apparently in warfare? 318. That's the number chapter 14 will give us. And Abraham will lead these guys out in battle against Chedorlaomer. That's chapter 14. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but that's all right, because I want you to get this picture of Abraham and Lot. And Lot's not a poor guy either. He's got flocks and herds. That's why they need to separate. What's happening between the two of them? Their herdsmen are having conflict. Just imagine you've got a flock that you've got to get some grass. You got to get to the grass or got to get to the water, whatever. And here's another guy who's got big flocks and herds, and they've got to get to grass and water. And you don't want your flocks and herds to intermingle. You're going to have to separate them out. So you're going to have to figure out who's going to go where. And that's what they're doing. What do you think about Abraham and his leadership in this particular instance? What do you see in him? Anything at all? Anything come to mind about him as a person? Okay. Right. How old is he?
90 plus 75.
Okay, 75 plus. Where do we get the 75 number? Jump back over to page. Excuse me, chapter 12 and verse 4. That's a point of reference right there. Chapter 12 and verse 4, it says he was 75. Excuse me. So he's 75. What else does this tell you about Abraham? He let Lot choose. Abraham could have said, listen here, nephew, I'm the big dog here. Everything depends on me, so this is where I'm going, and you get what's left over here. Instead, Abraham had more faith. I believe that. Now, it doesn't say that in the text, but that's what I believe. He was a man that I believe considered God to be providing what he needed. He will reflect that later when he offers up Isaac, or is about to offer up Isaac, and God stops him. What does Abraham call the name of that place? Do you recall? And I know I'm getting ahead of myself again. That's chapter 21. God will provide. Now, I don't think that's where Abram came up with that idea. I think he's always believed that. And this is like a culminating point where he said, God will provide. Yahweh will provide. So he's got this idea in mind. Now, can that impact our lives today at all? Laura's shaking her head yes, so it must be true. Now, who will back up Laura? How does this translate into today? What did Jesus say in the Sermon on the Mount about this? How did he address it? I don't think he talked about Abraham in the Sermon on the Mount. Right. Now, what was the context when he talked about the lilies and the birds? Right?
Just worry about today.
Mm-hmm.
Today has enough trouble of itself.
Right.
If we take care of things today, worship God today, he's going to provide that care. We have to have that type of faith.
Sure. He's addressing anxiety. And I know none of us are anxious about anything. But if you ever are tempted to be anxious about anything, remember Jesus said, be anxious for 50%. How much do you have to be anxious for to be anxious? I mean, if you're just anxious about 5%, that 5% is going to nag you to death. Because that's going to be the one thing, that's what we do when we lay down at night. We think about the one thing. Oh, there's one thing. If we could just get this resolved. Well, guess what would happen if you ever got that resolved? The next thing would slide up in its place, and you could be anxious about that. If we wanted to be anxious, there's plenty of stuff to be anxious about, but apparently Abraham wasn't like that, and this is before the Sermon on the Mount. Give the guy credit. He doesn't say, man, what's going to happen if I let Lot take, how was that land described? Like the Garden of Eden. How could Abraham let the Garden of Eden go in favor of his goofy nephew, Lot? Maybe that's what it was. I don't know. It doesn't say. It just says, hey, nephew, you take a look. And you go where you think best, and I'll take what's left. That's faith. Because he had a lot of stuff to take care of. And all that stuff depended on what the land could provide. These folks were living off the land. When Lot left, Abraham didn't send his servants to the nearest feed store and say, buy up some alfalfa and get a few round bales of hay. And no, there wasn't any of that. Everything had to come off the land. So he's a man of faith. He's also a man of generosity. But faith is what allows that. If you're worried, man, things are going to happen, I'm going to need all this stuff. If you're anxious about that and worried about that, then you have a hard time letting go of stuff. But if your faith is in God, you can be generous. You know he wants you to be generous, and you know you can afford it. The reason you can afford it is because of God. It's not because you've got more money besides that or more gold and silver. It's because you've got God. I think that's the way Abraham thought. And I think that's what we're seeing here. Isn't it interesting how that area around Sodom and Gomorrah is described like the Garden of Eden? Where is it most likely that the Garden of Eden, Sodom and Gomorrah were? Anybody done any research on this? The area of the Dead Sea is now where scholars, quote unquote, believe Sodom and Gomorrah must have been. What's that area like? Anybody been there? Anybody seen pictures? It's pretty miserable, pretty nasty. Okay? Did you?
I've been there twice.
You've been there twice. Is it like the Garden of Eden? I don't think so.
Some fat people go in the salt water
Yes?
and they're hoping to take the fat out.
To get the fat out in that salt water?
And that lake or they have some kind of mineral that's valuable. That's why Arabs are after them.
Ah, okay.
The land of Israel is beyond our comprehension.
They're doing quite a bit of good stuff over there with very little.
Always fighting, and then there's ambassador to Japan. They are always prepared for attack.
Wow. Well, they got to be.
So he took judo in Japan.
Well, Art had a hand up.
If I'm repeating something she said, I'm sorry, but they have geologists have found in that area evidence of sand having been melted into glass.
Right. Which, it's got to be pretty hot. What else is there? There's salt. That's what the Dead Sea is so full of. What did Mrs. Lot turn into? The pillar of salt. All the indications are that that's the area we're talking about. It used to be verdant, used to be like the Garden of Eden, used to be a great place to take your cattle and your flocks and your herds, not anymore. And that's after God was finished bringing judgment on the place. Now it says in verse 13 something about the men of Sodom. They were wicked how? Exceedingly, and as if that weren't enough of a description, sinners against the Lord. What was Sodom known for but sodomy? It's a town that gave its name to a practice that is as perverted as it comes. Now in chapter 14, I know, we're getting ahead, all the people of Sodom and Gomorrah will be taken captive by Chedorlaomer and his confederates, and Abraham will rescue them. It's almost as if God was saying to those folks, this is what your end could be, but I'm going to have my man save you. And then what did they do in response? They went right back to their ways. They didn't change a thing. And so in chapter 19, God will have to come back. And once again, it's God's man there, Abraham, who's going to be bargaining with God to try to save them. But that's down the road. We're not there yet. But I just want you to see.
Does that bring in, it references like a garden, like God's garden, and the evil that dwelt in the garden. Of course, we know about that and the Garden of Eden. But I wonder about how we are blessed now and how fruitful and great this nation is. And it seems to almost be the similar type of a thing that the evil, the more things are, of course, the more blessed things are, it seems like the more evil there is.
Right.
Is that not? Is that what that, I don't know, it's just a thought.
And you see this very same thing played out in life. It's so typical in our lives. When we're little, we're constantly dependent on mom and dad. And then we turn 13 and we figure out, hey, I'm big stuff all by myself. I can rebel. I can do things my own way, and I want to do things. It starts before that, but it's by the time you get to be a teenager, this mindset starts to come into play. And it's like, well, I'm no longer as dependent on mom and dad, so I can do what I want to do. And this is the same thing we see in cultures, in societies. When you're desperate, you tend to be more spiritual because you're looking for help. And you can't see where it's going to come, so you're depending on God, on some higher power, on some entity you can't see. It's not the government. Now that's where socialism wants to go. Socialism wants to make the government God, as communism does. But it's not the government. Where does the government get its wealth? From you. Now, I'm not downing governments. I'm just saying God didn't give us governments so we could look to them to be God. God gave us governments to govern affairs among men. And he did give us governments. He ordained that in Romans chapter 13. Paul makes it clear. By the way, when Paul wrote Romans 13 and said that governments were God's deacons to administer justice, what government was Paul living under? Roman. Not necessarily known for their mercy. Nevertheless, he wrote and he said that about governments. But governments aren't the means to spiritual security and prosperity. That's God. And so these folks, probably like a lot of folks in America, had evidently become comfortable with their prosperity. And when you get comfortable with your prosperity, it's like you start looking to God, or you stop looking to God for your needs. And if you don't need God for your needs, well, you don't need God to tell you what to do. You don't need God to tell you how to behave. I'm doing all right on my own. I've got a refrigerator full. I've got a nice house. I've got a car and plenty of gas. I got money in the bank. I just live the way I want to because I really don't need God. Look how I am right now. Did God do this? Oh, no, I did this. I got that job. I made that money. That's a scary circumstance to be in. Because once you're there, if you're a parent and you see your child getting this mindset, what are you obligated to do as a parent? You got to change their mind. How are you going to do that? You're going to have to start removing blessings so they can see where it comes from. You're going to have to start altering their thinking. And I believe that's what God was doing with Chedorlaomer. Now, the text doesn't say that, but when he allowed them to come and take them captive, it was God's man Abraham who was there to rescue them. And it would be God's man later who would be there to bargain for their lives and who would lose because of their behavior. All right. Anybody got any observations or questions about anything in chapter 13 at this point? We're not quite done. Verse 11, Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. Abraham settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley. So we're east of Jordan, and we're in a valley, Makes sense, the location. Abraham settled in the land of Canaan while Lot settled in the cities of the valley and moved his tents as far as Sodom. By the time we get to chapter 14, will Lot still be living in tents? No, he'll be living in Sodom. He'll be in amongst it, which only makes sense. If you're living outside of town and you're in a tent and you look, hey, there's people living in houses over there, we could move over there. If you've got enough capital, if you've made enough money, you can keep your servants hired to stay with the cattle and the flocks and the herds, and I'm going to move into town. That's apparently what Lot did by the time chapter 14 rolls around. Verse 14, the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, and eastward and westward. All the land which you see, I'll give it to you and your descendants forever. I'll make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered. How many children does Abram have? 0. Zip. Nada. Zilch. Doesn't have any kids. But God's telling him, I'm going to make your descendants. How old is Abraham? 75. 75. Arise, he says in verse 17, walk about the land through its length and breadth, for I will give it to you. See, God, he's repeating this promise. He's assuring Abram, this is what I'm going to do. Abraham moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. All right, here's the next thing I want us to consider. Abraham does what at Mamre? He builds an altar. Is this the first altar he's built? It's not. Go back to chapter 12, verses 6 and 7. For me, it's just the other page. It says, Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem to the oak of Moreh. Not Mamre, but Moreh. It says, the Canaanite was then in the land, and the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. So Abraham did what? He built an altar there. He built an altar there. Then he proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of Bethel. Anybody know what the name Bethel means? If it's got an L, E-L on the end of it, that E-L almost always means God. Beth means house. So the city, town of Bethel, that area, that place was called the house of God. Proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. So how many altars we got so far? 3 altars. Abraham is an altar builder. Why do you build altars? To worship. To worship. I wonder how long it took to build an altar. I wonder how big they were. Don't have any of that information, but it must have taken some effort. It must have taken some time. And it was something that was important enough to Abram that he did this in every place he went. He would build an altar and he would worship. Any lessons in there for us? What's that? Worship where you are. Worship where you are, and worship how you know to worship. Where's the first place we read about animal sacrifice? Specifically, it's with a fellow who was murdered right after that, Cain and Abel. Abel offered from his flocks. Cain did not. Cain got upset because his offering was not accepted and Abel's was, and so Cain killed his brother. Now, that's the first obvious reference to animal sacrifice. The first one might have been when God clothed Adam and Eve with animal skins. Where'd he get those animal skins? Probably the first deaths that took place in the world. Animals that died so that the nakedness of Adam and Eve could be clothed. Isn't that interesting? Our nakedness is still clothed with death. Sin makes us naked, but the gift of Christ's sacrifice is what covers that nakedness up. Same thing. Altars. Abraham is a worshiper. He doesn't just talk the talk, he walks the walk. All right, anything on the altars? Animal sacrifice. Let's talk about chapter 14. We won't read the entire chapter. The first several verses talk about Chedorlaomer and his confederates coming down and taking the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah captive. But let's start at chapter 14, verses 13 to 16. Who'll read that? Anybody? Need a reader? All right, Jake's got that. And Steve, if you will read 17 to 24. All right, chapter 14 of Genesis.
Then a fugitive came and told Abram the Hebrew. Now he was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, and brother of Aner, and these were allies with Abram. And then Abram heard that his relatives had been taken captive. He led out his trained men and wanted his house, 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. He divided his forces against them by night. He and his servants and defeated them and pursued them as far as Obah, which is north of Damascus. And he brought back all the goods and also brought back his relative Lot with his possessions and also the women and the people.
After his return to the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Sheba. And the king of Sodom outside one. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him 10 days, and the king of Sodom said to him, Give me your persons, but take the vision for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have delivered your hand over as God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I have not taken thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, unless you should say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing but what the good man leave, the share of the men who went with me. But Aner, Eshcol, and them will take their share.
Very good. How does Abram find out about the attack on Sodom and Gomorrah? Somebody escapes, comes and tells him. He's called a fugitive in the English translation. What's he do? He finds out his relative's been taken captive. He gets his, how many men? 318 men. And how are those men described? Born in his house. And what else? Trained. Trained to do what? Well, it doesn't say fight, but if they're trained to milk cows, or if they're trained to herd goats, and you know those guys knew how to milk cows and herd goats, but when it says trained men, I really don't think he's talking about anything that has to do with agriculture. I believe he's talking about men in this context trained to fight. That's what I think, trained to fight, because that's what they do. What sense would it make to tell us they were trained men for something like hoeing gardens, and unless you wanted to make a point, well, see, these guys shouldn't have been out there fighting, but they did fight. And what else did they do besides fight? They won. They won the day. They won the battle. I'd like to have some more details, but there aren't any. That's all it says. 318 men. They went in pursuit of Chedorlaomer. King James calls it a slaughter when he returned from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer. I like that word. Observations?
It says that these two men were Abram's brother. Is that used loosely?
Aner and Eshcol, they were brethren. How far was this from the Tower of Babel and the flood? We're talking probably less than 300 years. So everybody had relationships. See, this isn't, the flood was not ancient history to Abram. It wasn't that far back. So what it says about these guys, that they were allies, and then what passage are you looking at? What verse are you looking at with? Okay. The brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and these were allies with Abram. let's see, the fugitive came and told Abram the Hebrew, and he was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, brother of Aner, and these were allies. So they were brothers with Mamre, but they were allies with Abram. Does that make sense? Can you see that there? Mamre is not just a place. Mamre is the name of the guy who had the oaks of Mamre. Mamre's oaks. Yes, that's Mamre. Mamre was the brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner. But everybody, this just isn't that far from the flood and from Babel, so there's a lot of relationships going on. By the way, at Babel, what happens? People groups are split up based on languages, so we don't even have everybody in this part of the world. People have been scattered hither and yon because their languages have been confused. Where are we here? Verse 17. After his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer. By the way, why doesn't God stop him and say, now, Abram, I don't want you to use violence? Did God let him use violence? Yeah, quite a bit of violence with 318 men. Why didn't God stop him while he was training those 318 men? Hey, Abraham, what are you doing training these guys to fight? He had 318 men trained apparently to fight. That's what they did. And what happens when he comes back? Who does he meet? Who is Melchizedek? How can he be a priest? We don't even have the law yet. How do you become a priest of God if the law has not been delivered on Mount Sinai? What must there have been prior to Sinai? There were men who were priests, and this guy was one of them. Not only was he one of them, how is Melchizedek later used? He's used as a type of Christ. Keep a finger there in 14, Genesis 14. Go to Psalm 110. When David, excuse me, when David penned this psalm, he mentioned Melchizedek. And when he mentioned Melchizedek, who he was really talking about was Jesus. Look at verse 1. The Lord says to my Lord. Now, who's the Lord? Who's the first Lord? That would be God the Father. And who's the Lord that the Lord is speaking to? That would be Jesus. I believe in context. The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand. How did David know about Jesus unless it was through the inspiration of God? How did David know that there was a Lord, but there was another Lord besides the Lord? And I'm not trying to be funny. I'm just talking about what this psalm is saying. He says, sit at my right hand until what? Until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. The Lord will stretch forth your strong scepter from Zion. What's a scepter for? It's for ruling. Kings have scepters. And where's it going to go forth from? From Zion. Rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people will volunteer freely in the day of your power. In holy array from the womb of the dawn, your youth are to you as the dew. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, according to what? According to the order of Melchizedek. Genesis 14 is the only place. It's the only place where we see Melchizedek doing anything. And what is he doing? He's blessing Abraham as Abraham returns from a military action that saves people from death and slavery. Abraham is a soldier. He's got trained soldiers. They're in his house. He leads them out to rescue people who are being persecuted, who are being enslaved, who've been kidnapped from their homes. And when he comes back, this man, Melchizedek, the priest of God, of whom is likened to Jesus in his order, He blesses Abraham upon his return. I find this very fascinating. Perhaps you do as well. I'd like to know more about Melchizedek, but this is all God told us. And therefore, it's what? It's all I need to know. It's all I need to know. What's that? What's Salem mean? Peace. King of peace. Jesus is a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, who was king of peace, who blessed a man who returned after rescuing people who were victims of evil. Boy, you talk about a likening to Jesus. I don't know how it could be any more of a likening to Jesus. So what does Melchizedek say to Abram? Look at verse 18. Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. He blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." Melchizedek is attributing God as the one who delivered Abram from his enemies. So all of this, it's like God is saying, this is all good. This is so good. Melchizedek is the one I'm going to use as a type for my son, and this is the only thing I'm going to show you about him. He's blessing a man who's rescued people from evil. The irony is, what do these people do who are rescued from evil? They go right back to practicing evil. There's no parallel to today whatsoever. So, now the king of Sodom said to Abram, verse 21, "Give the people to me and take the goods for yourself." How does Abraham respond? Past tense, he says, "I have sworn." He doesn't say I'm about to or I'm going to. He says, "I have sworn." What has he sworn to God? I'm not going to take a thread. I'm not going to take a sandal thong. I'm not going to take anything that's yours for fear that you would say, "I have made Abram rich." Now, it doesn't say this, but what do you think Abraham wants people to believe about him and his wealth? God has made him rich. I don't want anybody to say that you're the one who made me rich. And I hope I'm not reading too much into this, but here's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking Abraham wasn't a fool. He knew how those people behaved. And he didn't want to come away from this mess, having done something good that God has blessed, and then profit from people who lived the way they lived. I don't think Abraham wanted that taint. To him, I think that would have been dirty money. Now, we're the one that made you rich. Yeah, that's the way it works in the world. Yeah, we know that. We understand that.
And therefore that would make him a partaker in their beliefs and actions.
Right. Now, how easy would it have been for Abraham to say, "Well, I earned this. I'm the guy that trained these 318. I'm the one who took all the risk. I could have," and maybe he did even lose some guys in this battle. I don't know. But he says, "No. I forswore to the Lord." He went out ahead of time knowing that he'd promised, "I'm not taking anything from these folks. I'm going to go do this. It's the right thing to do." Now, you'll have to read this yourself and judge whether I'm reading too much into it, but this is the way I see Abraham being presented. A man of courage, a man of character, most of all, a man of faith. Yeah, he lied about Sarah. Why would he do that? I don't really know, but I know that in the process of doing that, God blessed him. He became wealthier in the process, so if God wants to bless you, he's going to bless you in spite of your doofus self. He does that to you and me all the time, does he not? So maybe that's what he's doing with Abraham. And he's got a plan. He's working something out with Abraham. And it's not just for Abraham. Who's it for? What did the promise say? All the families of the earth will be blessed through Abram. So if I'm reading this, I'm saying, go for it. Yeah, do that. It's like Moses later on. There were some people prophesying in the camp, and they came to Moses. Some bit it came to Moses, other people are prophesying. He says, well, I wish everybody was a prophet. In other words, don't be jealous for me because I'm God's prophet and somebody else is prophesying. I wish everybody was a prophet, telling people what the Lord would say. Excuse me. That ought to be our spirit all the time. Never be jealous of somebody who's doing good because they're going to get more credit or more honor than you. You see somebody doing the Lord's work, bless them. Pray God that they be strengthened. May their tribe increase. Be that way. Abraham was not small. Abraham was not selfish. He somehow had a huge mind towards God, and maybe it was because he wasn't that far from Babel. He wasn't that far historically from the flood. Maybe he had to be retaining all this information and say, wow, God's really something. He's great. Abraham knew God. He was God's friend, the text says. There was a relationship between them that was close. That's a relationship that I know the Bible says not to covet, but we ought to covet that. I hope you agree with me on that. That kind of a relationship where there's, and not to take it from Abram, but to have it for ourselves, that we're so close, we have that kind of faith. Bell's rung. Anybody have any observations about this you want to bring out? Any questions, any comments?
I think Melchizedek, I think I saw a slide of him in another one of those verses you read in there. But it showed his humanness, and always before he seemed so untouchable.
Mm-hmm.
Because he was so secretive, special in so many ways, but he tried to make a deal with that.
Well, it was a good thing. Now, this is the king of Salem, not necessarily Melchizedek. Or the king of Sodom, I'm sorry. No, this is the king of Sodom. Melchizedek is the priest, but there's the king of Sodom, two separate guys. And it's the king of Sodom who is trying to, verse 21, the king of Sodom says to Abraham, give the people to me, take the goods for yourself.
I see, I read it wrong.
It's easy to do because you got similar words and similar offices. But what did Abram do regarding Melchizedek? Of the spoils, what did he give him? Gave him 10%. So Melchizedek is getting his official due. Melchizedek wasn't demanding that. It's just, hey, I'm coming to the priest of God. I'm turning over to him 10%. Where did 10% come from? I thought that was the law. There's no law yet from Sinai, but we've got 10% mentioned right here, a tenth. Lots of interesting things right here. All right. Anybody else got anything? It was too late.